Set your course for the Hoth
Takes podcast.
Welcome to Hoth Takes. I'm Eric Yeller.
I'm Haley Bird-Wilt.
And Grace Seegers is not with us in this episode, but we do have a very special guest with us. We are joined by security reporter at Wired, Lily Hay Newman, who has been on the show before, and we're thrilled to have her back. Lily, welcome back to Hoth Takes.
We're back, baby.
We're so back. And we've got a topic this time around that should inspire some interesting conversation. With recent Star Wars projects on screen and upcoming projects not really focusing too much on the Jedi, between Andor and the upcoming Mandalorian movie, we thought we would talk a little bit about, is that where we want the Star Wars franchise to be? Do we want stories that mostly don't focus on the Jedi and the Sith and the sort of Force mysticism? Or do we want to go back to some of the Jedi-focused storytelling that was really at the core of the original trilogy and the rest of the Skywalker saga? I know we've got some slight potential differences of opinion here, so I'm really excited to jump into that. Maybe we could start by talking about what these stories do for the franchise when we focus on Force users and the Force itself as a property that's just binding the galaxy together. What does that add to Star Wars storytelling? And how does that balance out or enhance or supplement the stories that we've seen like Andor that are about people who don't have special powers? Lily, I think you might have some strong feelings about this, so I'd love to open it up to you first.
Well, mainly I would just say that I am pro stories about Force users, or like that is my personal favorite type of Star Wars story. And I like the other stories too. I think it's been great that there's been more focus away from that lately, like you were mentioning, and to sort of have a balance and have both. But ultimately, stories about non-Force users are our entire lives. So I kind of come to Star Wars for the Force lore, personally.
I think obviously they're very central to the franchise as it has been, and I could land on either side of the debate. I know there is a large contingent of I don't know, I would say more literary minded people who would like to see stories of ordinary people doing their best in the galaxy, and those are the people who really love Andor, and I for that reason I also love Andor. But there is something very special when there is room for the transcendent and the kind of mystical side of Star Wars, which by the end of Andor I was craving, even just an ounce of it. So I think it is central enough to the stories as they started off to need to continue to be a presence in some way.
Yeah, Lily, when you were watching Andor, was that something that you felt the absence of pretty keenly, or did you not even... I mean, for me, it didn't even occur to me for most of the show that we weren't focusing on Force users, because I already sort of thought of Cassian as a Star Wars main character, capital M, capital C, because he was in Rogue One. I didn't feel like I was watching so much an everyman as maybe if Andor had come before Rogue One. But did you feel like the show was a big departure from what we had expected from Star Wars in terms of the character focus?
I see what you're saying about if it had been made before versus after. It didn't bother me. I thought it was great. And like Haley was saying, I think there's a desire from the fan base overall, or certainly some segments of it, to highlight the daily life of regular people in the galaxy. And so I feel like, and I agree and feel like that's really important. And so I was happy to see it there. But like I said, to me, it's kind of like the Force is kind of the whole thing about Star Wars, right? Otherwise it's just another universe or our own world or whatever. So I think I always am missing it a bit if it's not there, because I don't know. That's probably unsophisticated of me, or sort of reductive, but it is kind of the key element to me that is what I come to Star Wars for.
Yeah, I wonder if the fan base is predominantly thinking that way or thinking that they want familiarity. Because I think, especially with, I mean, think about what made Star Trek so popular and so pioneering early on. It wasn't necessarily the escapism. It was the idea that there are things here that we can recognize as very much our own world, even if it's taking place in a time where a lot of problems have been solved. And that was part of the appeal. In addition to the fantastic elements, it was like, I can see the connections to real world issues and dynamics. And Star Wars is not Star Trek, but Star Wars also has found some of its biggest success when it does have those hooks into real world relatable issues. Even the prequel trilogy, I think, as criticized as it has been, one of the things that gets praise from a lot of fans is the way that it tries to wrestle with real issues of democracy and authoritarianism. And it has Force users in that, of course, but that element of it is praised for the realisticness, the verisimilitude. So I guess I'd be curious to hear what the two of you think about how a franchise that is beloved for both of those reasons should balance how much it's telling stories that are beyond anything we could ever see in the real world, and how much it's telling stories where the real hook for this drama is that could be my world to some degree.
Yeah, it's a good point that Star Wars is sort of hybridized in that way. But I guess to me, it's not the same as Star Trek or like The Expanse universe comes to my mind as another one where you're watching and you're like, oh yeah, it's like us in 100 years or however, or 1,000 years or whatever. Star Wars to me is more like, wow, their universe is so different and yet the themes are so similar. Like, what can we learn from this about our own world by looking at a totally different universe? I don't know. The setup of the similarities feels different to me. But it's a really interesting comparison.
I feel like Skeleton Crew is a good example of striking that balance. Like, it is a whirlwind, rollicking adventure with a lot of whimsy, but it also, like, there are parts where it's like suburban life, even though it's in Star Wars. So it's both relatable and also slightly escapist. It's kind of more fantasy than science fiction, which I think is something so special about Star Wars. And kind of in the same way that Dune is like, this is also kind of a medieval fantasy novel, but also science fiction. Like, Star Wars doesn't shy away from mysticism and spirituality, and like, as human beings, at least historically, human beings have not shied away from that either.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Having the Force stand in for the mystical and the religious that exists in the real world, where people find solace in their faith in a higher power. I mean, with the Force, it's made manifest in a way that is not directly comparable to human religion, but it does have that same element of there's a comfort in a belief that there's an order to things, that there is something more than this flesh and blood, more than this crude matter, as Yoda puts it. And so it's not as if there's two types of stories. There's Force stories and there's relatable stories. That's not the dichotomy. But I think it'll be interesting to see for Lucasfilm, especially after the success of Andor. Do we think that they're going to perhaps overlearn the lesson of Andor and shy away from stories that have a lot of Jedi stuff? I mean, that as we've established, that's not the lesson to learn from Andor, but that doesn't mean Disney won't learn that lesson from Andor.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know, but I could definitely see some over-indexing in the other direction, just because it feels like that's kind of a lot of how decisions are getting made right now. Though, I mean, again, I don't really know. But the other thing I was just thinking about is that in Clone Wars and all the animated Star Wars material, I feel that they kind of have an easier time switching back and forth and grappling with this versus in live action, because you can just, the Force stuff can just happen so much more easily in animation. And I guess, now with the convergence of like intense CGI and whatever, maybe this is less of a thing, but that was just something I always really loved about all the animated work, is that there's just that weight is lifted kind of needing to worry about how to make sure the Force elements are looking really great, or that everything that you would want to see you can show the audience. It's just like you can do anything, So I don't know if you all feel like that's a factor, but I've found that, and that's another reason I think the extended universe and the novels and everything has always been so core to Star Wars, is that then you can just have the Force totally unleashed as we imagine it in our minds.
Oh, definitely. I think about the Clone Wars, the micro series they call it, that ran, I think, in the lead up to or directly after Revenge of the Sith. I forget which one it was, but it was the 2D animation, not the 3D that was used for the Clone Wars. And that one was exactly what you're describing, almost tall tales of the Jedi at their most super heroic. I mean, you had Mace Windu just wiping out an entire droid army with like one wave of his hand. And that show is not canon, but it is used as a template for like what would people in the galaxy tell stories about when it comes to the Jedi. And part of the reason that works so well is you look at that show and it's really the Jedi at their most powerful, the Jedi at their most legendary. And I do think that it's hard to translate that even into the 3D Clone Wars, where they tried to make it a little bit more realistic, and then certainly into live action. I think that's got to be a factor, not necessarily a controlling factor in the stories they tell, but it has to be part of the conversation that you can't have. I mean, even, I think Dave Filoni has talked about this with Ahsoka, bringing her into live action. She can't move the way she does in animation. And one of the things that is not unique about her, but fun about her, is that she's very bouncy and very light on her feet and very agile, and that's part of her fighting style in the Clone Wars, and she just can't be that way in live action. So I think that necessarily limits some of the attraction of having a Jedi in your show, is that they can't move the way they do in either of those Clone Wars shows.
It's almost like a recession indicator. Like, how powerful are the Jedi in the whatever the new Star Wars show is? No, I also, like, at least in the corner of the world that I come from, which is very very Christian, there has been this ongoing discourse of disenchantment for a few years now, which is this theory of like humanity feels, the world itself feels very disenchanted. It almost like something has been lost. And people are always debating, like, and these are very like intellectual people who are really into like T.S. Eliot, and they're like, how do we re-enchant the world, or at least bring back that feeling of like there is something greater, and there's like theories behind it of like, oh, it's technological innovation, these kinds of things. And I do kind of, and it goes back to like the prequel era, this debate. It, like, I do think the sense of disenchantment does permeate culture and Star Wars as well. Like midi-chlorians, the debate over like, oh, you've rationalized it too much. You have turned the Force into like a test that you can take to see who is the most Force sensitive, instead of something like I said, like mystical and it's kind of mysterious and enchanted. It has become this like rationalistic Enlightenment era kind of thinking about Star Wars. And so like I naturally am really into when Star Wars is weird. And that's partly why I think Ezra is my favorite Jedi, is not only is he turns out to be a very virtuous character in the end, even though he starts out kind of like a space Aladdin. But he also has these really strange like Force powers. Like he's really in touch with animals. Has this kind of like empathy and like ability to communicate with other created beings that I really love to see. So that like, and you're kind of right, Eric. I think the animated shows have the ability to do that far more so than the live action ones. Like I'm thinking of the big Force guy who kind of sits between the light and the dark.
Oh, the Bendu. I was just going to bring that up. Yes,
the Bendu. He's so weird, but I love to see the Bendu. Like, I do think those stories will always have a special place in my heart, more so than like things like Andor. Even if they're like technically perfect, the most beautifully done art, like I still do want to have this sense of enchantment at the end.
And you even saw Andor try a little bit to dabble in that with the Force mystic who tells Cassian that he's destined for something greater. And I remember at the time, and I still feel this way, but that was actually something I didn't like because I didn't want anyone in the show to have a sense of his out of universe or of his in-universe importance that only a viewer should be able to have. It felt a little too like just so for like any of the characters to be like, oh, Cassian has a destiny. Like I think one of the reasons the show works so well is that at no point does anybody around him really think that he has a destiny, or at least in my interpretation, it didn't seem like people thought he had a destiny any more so than like any of us would say like, oh, you're destined for great things, kid. Like once you bring the Force true, like capital D destiny into it, it's a different flavor of story almost. And I wanted those things to be separate. But that said, we know that there are characters who not only have big destinies like Anakin and Luke, but the people around them have a sense of that for reasons that are believable. Like the Chosen One prophecy exists in universe, so it makes sense for people to treat Anakin and Luke as if they have destinies because they're interpreting a prophecy. Cassian, it doesn't really make as much sense in my opinion, but that is something as we segue here into like thinking about the benefits of a Force user story and the things that are I'll use the word tricky. One of the rewards of these stories is that you do get to unlock these mystical journeys, these adventures into the corners of Star Wars where there isn't a simple explanation for everything. Maybe there isn't even any explanation. It's hard to necessarily look at a place like Star Wars where so much has been explained in the TV shows and the books and the role-playing game supplements. I mean, there's explanations for so many things, and yet we do see things in Star Wars that don't have very simple explanations or very scientific explanations. Even the space whales, the idea of an organic creature that can go to hyperspace, access that dimension, that's not explained. We're just told this is the way it works and deal with it. And
doesn't Ezra talk to the space whales at some point?
Yes, he communes with them.
He's a friend to the whales.
And that too, the animal communication side of things, like I think by saying like the Force is at work and this is a Force power, you really do a lot of narrative work justifying why something is the way it is, because if the viewer has already bought into the idea that there is a mystical energy field that just works with its own will, you can have characters do a lot of things without having to explain it, because you can say this is the will of the Force, they're tapping into the Force, all living things are connected to the Force, so a loth cat and a human can connect on a level that is based on the Force, and you don't have to provide a biological scientific explanation for it. And I think to your point, Haley, about the idea that, we've mapped the whole world, we have satellites, there's no undiscovered country, we've explained and answered so many things scientifically. One of the joys of a Force user story in Star Wars is you can have this hyper-rational world with a lot of sci-fi high-tech elements, but there's still that mystical energy field that allows you to do things like animal communication, and it's integrated into the vibe of Star Wars. It's not some kind of outlier that's at odds with the rest of the storytelling. It's not in tension with the high technology elements. It fits into that vibe without being strange.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I was just thinking that Cassian is sort of like a Han Solo character to me, where, and there's probably a lot of other examples in Star Wars too, where, but typically they are, in contrast to Force users, these other incredibly exceptional people in this universe who, don't have Force powers and yet and maybe don't have a destiny or definitely don't have a specific like prophecy about them that everybody knows about or something, but who are incredibly special and powerful people without the Force. And that I feel like is typically, though not always, highlighted in Star Wars because they are being contrasted with Force users.
Yeah, and that goes to this whole idea of what is impressive about Andor and the characters of Andor is how much they're able to do without these powers. And the implication is sort of that Force users have it easier and their accomplishments are not necessarily as impressive because they have this leg up on everybody else. And that, I think, leads to one of my observations about the difficulties of Jedi and Sith stories is because they're so powerful, you have to come up with a really good reason why they can't just, to use a video game term, just kind of one-shot their opponents and win the fight right away. You have to give them something that they have to deal with that isn't as simple as swinging a lightsaber, deflecting blaster bolts, pushing somebody off a cliff with the Force, right? There's all these, Star Wars authors and screenwriters will have to sometimes contrive their way into a villain who is not easily defeated. And you have all kinds of answers to that question. They have hostages, or they've got some special weapon, or, one of the things I've noticed about the comics especially is that they've given there are weapons in the galaxy that can resist lightsabers. The Mandalorian armor has the special property, and I've noticed the proliferation of this metal in more and more weapons, and it's in the hands of more and more villains, even like low-level 2-bit villains who you wouldn't think would be able to get this stuff. And I think the idea there is it's hard to give anybody a leg up against a Jedi or even a fighting chance because they're so powerful, and so you've got to give them the special weapon that can block a lightsaber, even though, again, the whole point of a lightsaber is they're supposed to be able to win pretty much any fight of like object on object. And it feels like that's being diluted a little bit because they need to give these other villains, all these villains, weapons that do not end the fight right away. So I don't know. I know that Lily, you are very eager for more of these characters. Do you have thoughts on how to integrate these essentially superheroes into a story where most of the other people are not superheroes, but still make it not a fair fight necessarily, but an interesting fight that lasts more than a few seconds? I mean, to me, that does seem like a challenge for some of these stories.
The only thing that comes to my mind is that I think what was done with the Clone Wars arc is kind of what you need, which is like proximally in any given fight, a Jedi can win, but then there's like a bigger galaxy-wide or super arc going on of something like, the rise of a fascist regime or something that is not so easily addressed with any one fight, and that it feels like that is kind of the best, possibly the only way to have it be realistic, that there are obstacles that are bigger than any one Jedi. Also, there was one other thing I was thinking about while you were talking, which doesn't answer your question, but I was just thinking about how probably one reason The Mandalorian has been so successful and just for the fan base to learn more about Mandalorians is that they have their own mysticism and, their own mysteries and, otherworldliness. And that is an interesting and cool complement to learn about.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the Force users, but it is still this insular community that is not necessarily, the full contours of it are not obvious to the average person in the galaxy, and so you can still treat them as kind of a reclusive community with strange practices or whatever. Even if they don't have the Force, there's still that, as you said, that otherworldliness to them that makes them interesting, not necessarily, as peculiar as Force users. Yeah, Haley, I'm curious what you think about like finding stories where the Jedi actually have an opponent who can match them. I mean, it seems like part of the answer is not every story is just a battle, right? You have the Jedi going on adventures where they face other kinds of adversity.
Yeah. And I mean, like, one of the things the prequels did very well is show the Jedi like kind of at war with their own incompetence. So like there's always stories that you can tell about institutions crumbling, or institutions rising and revival, in a sense of how do you rebuild after that, which I guess is kind of the hope of the Rey film that might happen at some point. Yeah, I don't know if you can tell in this conversation, but I guess I am kind of thirsting after a sense of optimism. Even though I do really like the prequels, and I do like sort of examining institutional failures in the way that they did. Like, maybe it is a time to dream again, and and maybe that's the fact that I have small children who really like stories that are kind of boundless dreaming. But obviously it's Star Wars. There's always some kind of conflict going on. But sometimes that conflict is like a weird spiritual conflict, or a good guys against good guys, sort of finding a path forward. I'm also thinking, Eric, of the story arc in the Clone Wars, about the 3 Force entities.
Yeah,
which is
I was going to bring that up.
so deeply weird and wonderful because it's so weird. I don't know if they would make that today. Maybe they would. But I don't know. I definitely don't think that would have happened in live action. So maybe the answer to our questions here is just to make more animated content.
There you go.
That's the one on Mortis, right? With
it is
the father
yes.
and the sister, and yeah, I was going to bring that up too, because I mean that is just so memorable and was definitely the moment as I was watching. Wait, that series is called The Clone Wars.
Yeah.
When I was watching that series, I mean, I was really enjoying it and it was all good, but when I watched that, I was like, oh man, this is like, wow. I was just so blown away. And I totally agree that when they can really hit it with a story that just really captures your imagination, and that was a pretty depressing one actually, but it's just so amazing what happens. You're so transported that it's just so compelling.
And it was a really risky thing to add to Star Wars. I mean, it's still controversial to this day, the idea that there are essentially actual gods who are manifestations of different aspects of the Force, who don't directly control what happens in the galaxy, but what happens to them is intertwined with the high level vibe, if you will, of the galaxy. I mean, that's kind of still a controversial idea, but you'll notice that Dave Filoni is continuing that story in the next season of Ahsoka. We're going to see some version of the Mortis gods on whatever planet they're on in the other galaxy in Ahsoka. So there's still, I think, a desire, at least for Dave Filoni and the people who work with him, to explore that kind of weird side of Star Wars. And I will say, for all the criticisms that folks, and including myself, have of that show, bringing in the space whales, going into another galaxy entirely, I mean, that is some of the weirdest Star Wars that we've gotten recently, certainly in live action. I think we've kind of come to this consensus that the live action stories tend to be the most grounded, in as far as a Star Wars story can be grounded. That would be the exception by far. That's some of the most unusual Star Wars, both like to watch, but also if you're just a person in the Star Wars galaxy, the things that they do in that show, those are some of the strangest things that like a person could imagine doing in Star Wars. And so I think, yes, the animation allows you to do things both with like character movements and like tonally that are a little bit more out there, but there's a space for it in live action too, as Ahsoka is proving, although I guess we'll see how it's received. But I am hopeful, because I do like the more peculiar, hard to explain, almost mystical side of Star Wars. I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that in live action. I do want to talk a little bit about another way that I think these Jedi stories can be tricky. And Lily, I know you have some thoughts about this, but when I was putting together our notes, one of the things I put in there was, it can be hard sometimes to relate to the Jedi as opposed to the people that we see in Andor, because their lives are, I would argue, have more differences from our lives than the average Andor character's life has from our lives. There are more similarities there, at least in terms of the day-to-day stuff. But I know that you have some thoughts about that, so I would love to hear your views on kind of the relatability question.
Well, I do, but now that we've been talking, I also have some other thoughts, which is like to your question of what are the types of stories we can tell about Jedi that where they can't just magically solve everything with the Force. Like one thing, at least in the Jedi Order, that is often depicted, like that era, that speaks to relatability also is their how they kind of like all need therapy, you know, that they're being told to, you know, separate from your emotions, like release them into the Force, don't process them, and you know, we see this is like the entire point of, you know, one of the biggest arcs in the whole universe, what bad advice that is in terms of sort of reaching one's full power and potential in the Force to do good, and that is a challenge that I feel is depicted a lot, but also there, you know, there's plenty more room on Jedi attempting to grapple with their feelings and just sort of like be fulfilled, functioning people, given the training and the advice they've been given about how to handle themselves. And the tie-in being that I think that whole aspect of the Jedi is deeply relatable to anyone, even if we don't have all those powers.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, even if you can move things around with your mind, you still have, you know, anxiety about your place in your organization. You still want to live up to the expectations of your teachers, right? You still have competition with your peers. You still worry that you're not doing enough to make the world or the galaxy a better place. So there is relatability there.
And I think it's really common for people to feel like hard feelings are too hard. Like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to be angry or be sad or whatever. You know, I wish I could just sort of release all of this into the Force. Let me just try to, you know, I don't know, move on or take a deep breath or something. And so I think it's very relatable, the need to like have the epiphany that we need to actually engage with our emotions and process them.
I love that phrase, release all of it into the Force.
Isn't that what they say?
I feel like, yes.
Maybe I made that up.
There is a romance to that.
And I know that, Lily, you were also, you had put something in our notes about another reason why Force user stories are attractive, another thing that makes them narratively interesting for us.
I think it was that their powers, like if I think about different cinematic universes or fictional universes, the Force powers to me feel like a very close fit with what people could almost imagine, like powers that they could almost imagine having themselves, because I feel like we have all been sitting on the couch and the remote or the glass of water is across the room, and we've thought to ourselves, like, it almost feels like I could bring it over here with my mind, like that the Force is real and that I could just do that. And these are silly examples, but like when they really sort of muster all their Force energy and use it to do like a big jump between two buildings or whatever they're doing, I don't know, those types of things feel like almost possible. And the way that they can, you know, these aren't the droids you're looking for, the ways that they can influence other people's behavior or reactions, but also the limits of that. I don't know, it just feels very, very close to our reality, even though it's not at all. So I feel like that is something that is almost relatable, but definitely compelling, and one of the reasons that I feel like Star Wars has been so successful.
I feel like, yes, every child upon seeing it does try to use the Force. It does feel like we should be able to.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to something innate in us, and that's, I think, why it's so successful, is that we've all wanted to make our lives easier in some of these simple ways, but also we've all wanted to persuade people of something. And the mind trick, while it has problematic implications as well, it plays on this idea of like, how much easier would our lives be if we could just convince people to believe us, to trust us, to let us do, what we felt was necessary. So it's, even though these are basically superpowers, they're deeply human in terms of why they resonate with us narratively.
And the morality and like the superstructure of, well, we need guardrails around how people use the Force, because if you can just do whatever, then you're just going to be rampaging around, taking advantage of people and being lazy or whatever you want to call it. It's relatable also that people would be like, okay, we need to like have some rules about how we all use this and try not to abuse it.
So we've established, I think, on this show that we are interested in more Force user stories, but which stories specifically? What besides the earliest era of the Jedi, when it all kind of began, which we'll get to in a second, what other Force user stories do we want to see? So I kind of wrote some down. I would love to hear your thoughts and definitely jump in with some others as well. But if you're interested in any of these, jump in and say why and maybe what specifically you'd like to see with these. They're roughly in chronological order. I think it would be interesting to see something about the Sith in hiding before the prequels. We kind of got a little bit of this with Acolyte, but we know that the Sith are quietly in the background, practicing the rule of two to rejuvenate themselves, all throughout the prequels and before the prequels, really. I would like to see a little bit of what it's like to be in hiding like that, to have all this power and yet to have to stay in the background because the time is not yet right to reveal yourself. Does that appeal to anybody else?
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting, but also like, I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, that I personally would be, if it's too much darkness, I wouldn't enjoy it. You've got to have some good guys in there as well.
Yeah. And it also would need to be a bit more sort of what it's really like to be a Sith type of stuff, because, Vader's castle, for example, is very cool and scary and whatever, but it's hard to imagine like living there day to day. Like what are the logistics of living in a totally inhospitable castle?
Well, I think you do have to answer the question of are they in like a villain lair somewhere, or are they disguised as regular innocuous people who are going out into the galaxy and getting food at the market and things like that?
Right, exactly. And I figure in that era that is more like what they would be doing. So I think it would be interesting to see kind of daily life. And I guess that's what you were saying, what it is like to bide your time. And it'd be weird to be like, yeah, I am a Sith, but I'm at the market just buying celery.
Okay, I fully agree, actually. Like, this is the perfect compromise. We've talked about like relatability and Force users. We need to combine the two things and see them in their daily lives.
You just want to see what they're buying at the market.
What kind of food? What are they cooking up at home? We need to know.
I also think it would be an interesting inverse of a lot of the stories after Order 66 where the Jedi are having to disguise themselves and scrounge for food, and they never know when there's an Inquisitor around the corner or something like that. I mean, I guess if it's two Sith, which is all that's left, the chances that wherever they go there will be Jedi around them are relatively low. They can plan for that, as opposed to if there were dozens of Sith out there, maybe the chance of them running into a Jedi is higher. But it would be interesting to follow two of them as they try to avoid detection in this kind of inverse to the dark times where it's the Jedi who are in hiding. So we've talked about the Sith in the abstract. Let's talk about one of them specifically, a very charismatic Sith, a fan favorite, Count Dooku. I've always been interested in seeing a lot more of how he became the man that he is by the time of of the Clone Wars, there was the Star Wars animated series, the Tales sort of anthology series. They did a Tales of the Jedi where he was one of the characters that they followed, and so we got to see a little bit of him going around and how he became the jaded man who was eventually open to joining the Sith. I would like to see more of that. I'd like to see more filling in those gaps, understanding how he becomes the man that he becomes, because he's so enigmatic. You'd think that going from a Jedi to a Sith would be a rockier journey, but at least what we've seen, they really try to make it seem like it's a smooth transformation of seeing the flaws in the Jedi and then just joining up with Darth Sidious. But I want a little bit more. I want to understand a little bit more about what makes this guy tick.
Definitely. I'm ready for that one. And can we just quickly recap? His master was Yoda, and he was Qui-Gon's master? Is that right?
Yes. So there's that continuity there. Another one that, again, we've seen during the Clone Wars animated series, we've seen some Jedi missions, but how much do you guys think, if they were going to do like the next project with Jedi, focused on Jedi, and they're giving you a list of options, and this is one of them, would you want it to be this one? Just kind of like an anthology of Jedi missions, either before the Clone Wars when the galaxy is relatively at peace, or during the Clone Wars, just seeing more of what they did when they were out in the galaxy. You know, I feel like it could be interesting, but also you could make the argument that the Clone Wars animated series did show us so much of that, although it was mostly focused on Anakin and Obi-Wan. So I'd be curious if you guys are hungry for more of that.
I think yes, if it was like something like a period of time I haven't seen before. I don't think I need more Clone Wars. I feel like there's enough Clone Wars content. Maybe that's a hot take in the Star Wars fandom. But I would like to see like Qui-Gon as a young person, especially since he was kind of a rebel within the Jedi Order. Like, I would like to see more of that. Maybe that already exists and I just haven't watched it. And there is a way to sort of do that episode structure of like, he's doing stuff, he's going on a mission, which I think is one of the charming things about the Mandalorian, like season 1, is it was set up in that way, kind of like episodic. But I don't know about more Clone Wars.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, I would take it, but I don't think we really need it from that era, because the animated show, like you said, it was a lot of Anakin and Obi-Wan and whatever, but there are storylines about others. And in fact, that's how I know who Plo Koon is, and that's a Jedi who I would love to know more about.
Well, what about, you probably couldn't have Plo Koon for this one, but what about Jedi on the run during Order 66? So this is kind of, again, we've seen this in the books. In fact, in the Expanded Universe, they had a whole series about one of the Jedi and his life on the run, but we haven't really seen a lot in live action, certainly, or in animation, really, beyond like Ahsoka, focused on Jedi on the run, having to fend for themselves and avoid the Inquisitors. Again, we see the Rebels cast during this time period. We see the Bad Batch cast during this time period, but we don't focus a lot on other Jedi and their struggles to stay alive. I feel like this one could be either interesting from the Andor perspective of it's a relatively no-name person who doesn't have destiny on their side, but it could also be not necessarily the best use of resources if there isn't a particular reason why we're following these Jedi around. Like, what will this story contribute to Star Wars? Is it just a slice of Jedi life? Like, is it very much that kind of, let's just drop in on some random Jedi and see how he's doing? Or is there a purpose to why we're following them around?
I worry that this would be a bit too bleak and depressing for me, but like kind of like what Haley was talking about before, Order 66 and that era, it's just so painful. But again, that's probably sort of a lack of sophistication showing, and I could see it being good fodder for some storylines. I would just sort of be like, oh man, this is going to be so brutal.
I have a way to ameliorate that. It's a romance. The two Jedi are in love. They love each other and they're on the run. That's how you fix it.
Well, I was going to point out that a bunch of things that have been pitched here so far are definitely like mainstays of the fan fiction circuit. Young Qui-Gon for sure.
Yeah, and also, if we want to keep things optimistic, there was, as we saw in the Obi-Wan show, a group called the Path that basically shuttled Jedi to safety and kept the flame of the Jedi alive wherever possible. And we're told that Quinlan Vos is involved in that, one of those kind of characters who got like a brief appearance in the Revenge of the Sith Order 66 montage, but survived and is a huge character from the expanded universe, big fan favorite. And so you could do a story about the Path and what it's like to fight back even when your very existence has been branded a heresy by the government. It ties into the more general kind of idea of a story about the rebellion, but in this case, they can't even go out in the open and do like a Saw Gerrera raid on like a shipping, convoy or something. Like they have to rebel even more from the shadows because there's Inquisitors everywhere. So I think that there's a potential for something that's generally optimistic if you focus on this group and their successes, but there are going to have to be some failures along the way. So it's not going to be all sunshine and roses. But then we fast forward to the post-original trilogy time period. We know that we're going to get, or if Disney's plans are to be believed, we think we're going to get a Rey movie where she's rebuilding the new Jedi Order after the rise of Skywalker. But would we be interested in a story about Luke trying to rebuild the Jedi Order after the original trilogy and before The Force Awakens? That's not an era that has been explored a lot, at least in terms of what Luke is up to. There's flashes of it in various stories, but we haven't really seen that. And I guess the question there is, knowing how it ends, would we still get something out of watching him try to rebuild?
I'm definitely very interested in that, except that I am not interested in a whole series of like deep fake young Mark Hamill.
Oh, I think you would have to recast it. I totally agree.
Look, I'm just saying. But yeah, in theory, I'm very interested in that era for sure. Because I mean, just the Empire has fallen. You're celebrating, and then like you wake up the next morning, and what do you do?
That would have so much charm if I didn't know what happens later. The Kylo Ren and all of that, just like, I don't know. I don't know if I would have the energy to watch all of that knowing what happens. Like I would want there to be some new frontier in some way.
So you're kind of more eager for the Rey version of that than the Luke one.
And that doesn't mean Mark Hamill can't be there. It's very much there can be a Force ghost talking to Rey during the film or the show, whatever format it ends up being made in. It would be fun to see him advising her and maybe like getting over his own trauma about Kylo when he tried to set up his force wielding school. I am excited for that, and I don't know. I would like for it to be hopeful, and obviously it's Star Wars. Again, there is conflict. There's always something going on that is not ideal. But I would like to see a very earnest attempt at striving toward greatness and virtue and a better life for the people who live in this galaxy. Like that. Again, that's not great. Maybe not the most engaging plot line, but there's a way to at least show that they're trying before you get to the wars and the conflict and all that.
And you also bring up something else that we can't do this episode without talking about, which is just like more Force Ghost stuff always. I'm always ready for more about how that all works or who else is a Force Ghost or whatever. Like that's a good area.
So we know that there is going to be a Rey movie. There's plans, at least, for this Rey movie with Daisy Ridley coming back. We also know that there's plans for a movie titled or a nickname Dawn of the Jedi. That's how Disney is describing it, from director James Mangold. And the idea is that they're going to go back, I think, like tens of thousands of years or something, to the dawn of the Jedi, the origin of this group as a group, using the Force and creating edicts and rules for how everything has to go. Are we even interested in that premise? Does going back that far before anything that we recognize as being Jedi to the origins of what we know to be Jedi, does that appeal to you guys? And what are you hoping from that movie?
I'll just say, for the very same reason that I don't want to see Luke right before the sequels, is I know what happens later. It will be hard for me to enjoy it. Again, I want to see something. I think it's possible for them to show me something new visually, but I want to see the story itself, the story of this galaxy being like pushed forward in some way. And I fear, just given the timeline, that's going to be very difficult. But I would, yeah, again, I would like to see. Obviously, there were periods of Jedi history where the Jedi were doing better as an institution. Like maybe we'll get to see the kind of hope and optimism and healthy institutions that I'm sort of craving in that film. But I would like to see some Star Wars content that is new and innovative and pressing forward into the future instead of just looking backward.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree, but I am very interested in the beginning of the Order and that specific trip down memory lane. I guess just because, I don't know if this is right, but I read that it would be really, really far in the past. Like, I don't know, thousands and thousands of years before. So it's kind of like, yes, this thing is looming, but that bothered me or was more difficult to cope with, in the Clone Wars or in the prequels or something where you just know it's imminently headed for this catastrophe. If we're really, really thousands and thousands of years before, I feel like it's less of a weight, at least for me. And I would be interested to see the founding of the Order and where everything came from.
Yeah, I think it is going to be very, very, very far back. And to your point, Haley, about wanting to see these healthy institutions, I think that at the time that this movie would be taking place, I think the Republic would exist. Obviously, we would be watching them, or one possibility is we'd be watching them build the Jedi Order as an institution. So it's not like we would probably be seeing that institution fully built and healthy and in a kind of like a status quo, like things are just idling along at a healthy clip. I think we'd be watching the struggles of getting some semblance of an order, with a capital O, around these Force practices, and even defining like lightsaber forms and Padawan rules and all the things that make this a group rather than just people disparately using special powers. So I think probably what you're looking for might come later than what this movie's envisioning. But Lily, to your point, yeah, it's kind of tough to watch like Andor or, the Clone Wars, given the imminency of the collapse and the fact that so many of these characters aren't going to get what they're working so hard for. But at the same time, you go far enough back and you can really build a world with almost no resemblance to the one that is eventually in thousands of years going to come to pass. So I do think that gives people the opportunity as storytellers to tell to do adventures where you're not kind of always metaphorically looking around the corner to Order 66 and saying, well, this is fun, but this person's going to be dead in a year. If you go far enough back, they can live and breathe on their own because, yeah, I mean, they're going to be dead by the time of Order 66. They're going to be dead in a few hundred years, except for Yoda, although this is even before him, obviously. But most species don't live more than, the average human lifespan. So you don't have to worry about, like, what horrible thing that I know is about to happen is going to claim these people's lives because it's just so uncharted.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. And you can have stuff that's like, okay, what if we have them shave their head except for this one little piece and they're going to grow it out really long?
So I actually would like to see in this movie a little bit of like wink, wink, like things happening accidentally that we know then become codified. Like, I think when you're going that far back, when you're essentially telling the like origin of this iconic group of characters, you can have a little fun with things like that, right? You not everything has to be solemn. There's probably going to be some solemnity because it's the Jedi, but yeah, you can have like a happenstance, like, oh, that's an interesting like hair thing that you've done. Like, that should be how we mark all Padawans from now on. Like, I think you can do a little bit of like winking at the camera because these are such iconic visual totems of Star Wars fandom that you can introduce them in that kind of like, yeah. I mean, and frankly, if you look at the real world, a lot of things that become lore and canon in like a human sense, they are accidental and things just happen and then they develop inertia of like, this is the way it's going to be. So it wouldn't be unrealistic for that to be the way that some of these things get introduced.
Yeah, I agree. And it would be interesting technologically as well to depict the galaxy, thousands of years before, and just daily life in a different era.
Yeah, I mean, we know from the High Republic book and comic project that wrapped up recently, it was like a 5-year project to basically explore what things were like a few hundred years before the prequel era, and what threats the Jedi had to face in that time period. And we know from the earliest phase of that project that hyperspace communication was still unreliable. A lot of the outer rim and wild space was unexplored. It was basically the Star Wars version of the map that says, there are monsters out here. And so even a few hundred years before the Skywalker saga, there's still a lot of development that needs to happen in terms of communications and exploration. So I can't imagine, there might not even be a cohesive galactic society 10,000 years or 5,000 years before the Skywalker saga. If we're truly going that far back, this could be like almost a Star Wars version of like the cavemen who discover fire, where there's you're so isolated and everything is still so new and perilous.
I hope the witches are around.
Yeah, that's interesting. What other groups will we see hints of or explicitly, will we see evidence that these other groups existed before the Jedi? I think that could be very interesting.
I'm sold.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Hoth Takes. Lily Hay Newman, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people follow you online?
It's a pleasure to be here, and you can find me on Blue Sky. I'm just at LHN.
Awesome, and people can also read your excellent reporting in Wired. Just a programming note for everybody, we will not have an episode next month in December. We're taking the month off for the holidays, but we will be back with you in January. And if you want to share your thoughts about this episode or suggest topics for future shows, you can email us at hothtakes@gmail.com. You can also reach out to us on X or Blue Sky. We've got links to our social media profiles in the show notes. Haley made our wonderful logo and banner art, and I edited the show and put together our music. As always, for legal reasons, we need to tell you that all Star Wars music and sound effects are the intellectual property of Lucasfilm. You can find a complete archive of past episodes on our website, hothtakes.wordpress.com. And if you like the show, please share it with a friend. You can find Hoth Takes on all the major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. We will see you next time. May the Force be with you.